I'm Jim Grismer, Professor and Dean Emeritus at the University of Denver. Welcome to Engaging Ideas, where we bring information and ideas from the academy to the community to help think about real-world questions. In today's discussion, we look at the state of democracy in the U.S. and around the world. The rise of illiberal democracies, populism, nationalism, coupled with eroding confidence in government, the press, and other institutions, is disquieting to many people. In our discussion, we'll consider what these trends might mean for democracy in the United States and globally. Joining me to help shed light on some of these trends is Floyd Cerulli, a widely respected pollster and political analyst, and the founding director of the Crossley Center of Public Opinion Research at the University of Denver. In addition to being recognized as one of the nation's most accurate pollsters, he's a regular media commentator on political events and an astute observer of public trends. Mr. Cerulli holds a bachelor's degree from UCLA and a law degree from Georgetown University. I believe you'll appreciate his insights as we talk about democracy on the defensive. So let's begin. Floyd Cerulli, welcome to Engaging Ideas.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
The changes in democracy globally and perhaps in our own country as well is a situation that some people find concerning, even disquieting. Maybe a good way to begin this is to ask you, what are the traditional principles of democracy? Where have we been traditionally?
Well, you know, we have close to 200 countries, and there's a lot of variety. But there have been clearly identified over many centuries, and in particular in the last few decades, the key elements of a full democracy. And at a minimum, obviously, it's elections. Fair elections, pluralism where other candidates and other parties can compete. Information that is free and there's alternatives. And of course in the election process itself, no fraud, the votes being fairly represented in the parliament or whatever government institution. But you know, there's also the institutions, the structures that sort of maintain democracy, and that's rule of law, typically an independent judiciary that can arbitrate disputes, including election disputes. And finally, and maybe most importantly from my point of view, and the one that may be a little in danger today, is a free press, a robust free press so that people can get alternative information out there, and also so that people who have complaints or concerns or a different viewpoint can get it expressed. The thing that we look at a lot as a public opinion pollsters and political scientists is what's the culture of democracy. That is to say, does the electorate, does the population in general, does particularly the elites, do they support democracy? Are they protective of minority rights? Are they protective of a free press and an independent judiciary? So those are kind of the elements we look at, and when they're fully mature, our sense is that that's a strong, contained democracy. It's viable.
Well, let's take a step back. What's been the trajectory of democracies in the developed world since, say, World War II?
Well, you know, we all sort of studied Greece and Rome, but there were only a handful through all of civilization, and sometimes almost completely extinguished. At the end of the Second World War, there were counted 17 with that criteria we just sort of mentioned. And today there's probably 60 to 80 countries that have either full or partial democracy out of that 200 I mentioned. And there were really two bursts of energy that came forward in terms of democratic processes and structures. The first was after the Second World War with the collapse of colonialism. And so you had countries in Africa in particular, but Latin America and other places that adopted democratic structures and free elections, relatively speaking. And then, of course, the fall of the Cold War. We had between 20 and 30 more countries, really in the 1990s and very early in the 2000s, adopt democratic procedures, by and large in Eastern Europe, and in places that had been contained by the Cold War and that structure. So today, we have this panoply of functioning democracies. And what we've been somewhat worried about since really about 2000 is some reversals. Some countries that are becoming either partial democracies, some countries that were partial becoming more authoritarian. So there's a real dialogue going on tonight, right now, and a concern about that.
Well, you've called that, I think, the great disruption. What are those elements that seem to be changing and evolving?
Well, you know, there's been a number of them, but probably a couple of the biggest was in 2008 and 9, the huge financial crisis. Most of these countries have adopted sort of liberal economics, market economics to some extent, and that was a huge crisis in capitalism. And of course, it tremendously affected Europe and America, and we are the countries that most promote democracy. And so it definitely was a setback there. People feeling that this incredibly slow growth, this economic divide that seems to be staying with us, sort of says to you, well, maybe we should look at some other system. Maybe this democratic system isn't working so well. Secondly, it's globalism. As you know, the sweep of the internet and the sweep of global trade and financial markets, of technology, has been extraordinary in terms of our wealth, in terms of the new tools we have to deal with, the amount of money that's moving in the world. But a lot of people got left behind. There are huge pockets of entire countries, but of industries and workers that have not been able to catch up with this globalization and feel hostile toward it. And then finally, the thing I look at, although there are others, is migration. We have more people moving today from particularly the southern hemisphere to the northern hemisphere, but throughout our continents than we've had since the Second World War. The recent figure I saw was 65 million people that are currently refugees. And we know the great movements, say, out of the Middle East and Syria that swept into Eastern Europe and caused a huge amount of disruption there. And that's kind of what we're talking about. The great disruption is a disruption of how we have been living, of our governing structures, of our capitalist system. And that's the questioning that's going on today that I think politicians and politics is having a hard time catching up to.
It strikes me that another issue that would be salient to this is the whole issue of public trust in institutions and government. We've seen that changing. Could you comment on your take on that change?
Well, I think you're right, and that is that public trust is one of the symptoms of the struggle that the establishment and our current systems are having in dealing with all this disruption. In other words, really, since in our country, for example, we've tracked it, but it's a worldwide phenomena, particularly in the advanced nations of Europe and also in Asia. But in our country, it began to drop during the Vietnam War, which people were very dissatisfied with, culminating in a low point in Watergate. There was a bit of an improvement in the Reagan era and 9/11. Normally when there's a huge crisis, people rally behind their governing institutions and their incumbents, the establishment. But now it's been on a slow decline through great economic disruption, and it has not recovered. As a matter of fact, right now it's as low as it's ever been in this country, and those statistics are fairly similar to what we're watching throughout Europe at the present time. And what it means is if you don't trust your government, that's not to say that you, when you go down and get your driver's license, you think you're not going to get it or you have to pay a bribe. But what it means is in terms of Washington, your national government, you've lost confidence that it can accomplish things. Your sense is that it is not really the government, that maybe you should look at an alternative, or maybe you should look at an individual that criticizes it. And in point of fact, we have been criticizing our government as a way to get elected here for several decades.
Right. And so the frustration that the public expresses, part of that seems to be from legislative gridlock, the fact that nothing seems to happen, government doesn't seem to address issues that are important in people's lives. What's underlying that from your perspective, Phil?
Well, I think there's a couple things. Number one, that trust immediately goes into confidence concerning institutions. And so there's a hierarchy. For example, at the present time in America, the military, the police, to some extent religion, medicine, those that are a little more authoritative in terms of, and authoritarian in terms of their outlook, hierarchical, are doing quite well. But when you look at those that we consider very democratic, that are the stalwarts of democracy, and that's, say for example, the media, very important, say for example, Congress, they're at the very lowest end of people not having confidence in them. And again, it reflects the fact that they are in gridlock, they're not getting things done. But you know, another issue that flows from that is this intense partisanship that has arisen. And that is also contributing to this, this gridlock and this sense of not being able to get things done.
You mentioned the media. Clearly, the media has seemed to come under fire in recent years. You engage with the media a lot. Tell us about your perspective on that, if you would.
Well, I have noticed that it's been at least 20 years in which there is almost a mini industry out there in terms of criticizing the media. You see it most commonly on talk radio, but now you see it sort of across the spectrum in terms of our politics, in terms of our alternative medias, and that is to criticize legacy and mainstream media. So today, 37% of the public is telling us that they do not trust the media at all, and almost 60% of Republicans. And you know, one of the most important jobs of the media is to be a watchdog, to tell on both sides, to criticize both sides in terms of our two-party system here. And today, almost 50% of the public doesn't respect that role. It used to be maybe 5% or 10%. That is to say, the party that was in would be not very supportive of the watchdog because they're the people being watched. But today, it is almost 50%. And that, of course, that role is incredibly important for democracy. Just as that partisanship is sort of pulling us apart, that's what you see. You see that partisanship also affecting the media. So the media is now having a hard time being able to be the watchdog that we expect, be able to bring credible alternatives. As you know today, the media is so fragmented in terms of all the alternatives, that the public, because of partisanship and their sort of ideological leanings, are also fragmented. We're tending to only go to the media that we think will have the message that we're interested in, making it extra hard to overcome that gridlock. So that our institutions are, to some extent, suffering because of both the partisanship, but also because we have pulled ourselves apart in terms of our respect for facts, our respect for some media that we can all trust and come together on.